Tēnā koutou katoa. It's my absolute privilege to welcome you today to this next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today we're hearing from my colleague, Associate Professor Lisa Tompson, who works alongside myself and our other colleagues at Te Puna Haumaru New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science. Lisa has worked in the field of crime science for over 15 years, and before that she was a police crime analyst. Lisa was awarded her MSc and PhD in crime science from University College London, where she worked as a researcher and then academic. Lisa's known for her work with crime reduction agencies, and she's really committed to exploring and testing ways to reducing crime that move us away from depending on the criminal justice system. And today, Lisa's here to talk about her work on poly-victimisation.
Kia ora, April. Okay, so tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for being here today to listen to our presentation on understanding poly-victimisation through an intersectional lens. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that my colleagues, this was a real team effort, who were involved in this project. They're on this slide here, including April, and the Ministry of Justice for funding the project in the first place. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what's coming up over hopefully no longer than 40-ish minutes, I'm going to set the scene in terms of the wider knowledge we have about re-victimisation and what causes it. And the reason I'm doing that is because poly-victimisation is a really understudied phenomena compared to the bigger evidence base that we have on re-victimisation. So I'll kind of set the scene first there before moving on to explain how we arrived at the research question that we did and then how our research unfolded. And then I'm just going to kind of bring it back at the end to a bit about what it might mean for prevention and also what it might mean about how we need to think about theorising about risk of acute victimisation. Okay, so right, just to kick off, just want to come back to this kind of fundamental truism, which is that research consistently demonstrates that crime is concentrated across multiple dimensions and across a range of scales. So a small fraction of areas typically account for a disproportionate amount of crime, a minority of time periods. So say, for example, Friday and Saturday nights for particular types of crime that's what police will be responding to most, and a small proportion of offenders commit the majority of crime, and a small fraction of victims account for a large proportion of all the victimisation experiences. Now, this is very generally known as the 80-20 rule, but it's also got other names such as the Pareto principle or Simpson's paradox. So you may have heard it in a range of those kind of different labels. Essentially what it means is that crime concentrates sometimes acutely. And what we also know from a fairly extensive body of evidence is that there are lots of overlaps between those dimensions. So the people living in high crime areas are more likely to be victimised. In fact, that might be why there is so much crime in those areas, because there's some repeat victimisation going on. We also know that time and space interact to bring people into contact with each other. And as some of this audience might well know, the people who are most likely to be at risk of offending are also highly at risk of victimisation. So lots of overlaps and lots of patterns. But why does this actually matter? Well, unfortunately, in the world we live in, the people and the organisations who respond to crime have pretty finite resources, so very limited resources, and it's best to put those limited resources into the places, times and people where they might have the best benefit. So identifying concentrations of crime helps us to identify where there might be what we call criminogenic situations. So these are situations or environments that encourage crime, right? So when we're identifying those criminogenic situations and the characteristics that make them so is pretty much the bread and butter of a crime scientist role. And that's what I've spent a lot of my career doing, specifically with a victim focus. So today I'm going to talk about that fourth type of concentration that I introduced on this slide, which is that concentration of victimisation. And the most kind of well-known type of that is repeat victimisation. So you may have heard about repeat victimisation. It's now entering its 5th decade, I think, in terms of the research that has been done to understand it. So this very extensive body of research was started in the 1980s in the UK Home Office. And the protagonists, Professors Kempes and Graham Farrell, are still publishing on this topic today. So it's got a really extensive kind of evidence base that sits underneath it. And as far as we know, the phenomena of repeat victimisation has been found in every place on earth it's been studied and for every type of crime it's been studied. So what is it? It's really defined as a form of crime concentration where there is the repeated criminal victimisation of a person, household, place, business, vehicle or other target, however defined. Okay, so pretty broad. So it can include things like cosmetics that are repeatedly stolen from pharmacies in terms of products. But usually we tend to think of it as humans who have been re-victimised in a defined period. And research can vary on this, but on the whole, 1 year is kind of the standard window that we kind of use in this type of research to measure repeat victimisation. So it's people, places, products, etc., that experience the same type of crime within a 12-month window. And we have a treasure trove of empirical findings about repeat victimisation. I haven't got time to cover them all today, but I'm just going to explain that, for example, we do know that re-victimisation is likely to happen soon after the original victimisation. So this is actually Aotearoa's research on family harm episodes. We can see from this that when repeated family harm that the police are actually aware of occurs, it most commonly occurs within that kind of 2-month period of when an original offence has happened. And other crime types exhibit slightly different patterns. So, for example, repeat burglary typically happens more swiftly. So we're talking in a matter of days and weeks rather than months there. And then website defacement at the other end of the spectrum, which is a kind of type of cyber vandalism, if you will, happens far more slowly. So that can be over, a year or two before the re-victimisation actually happens. But this repetition happens, and most often it happens fairly quickly. And those timeframes offer a very limited window of opportunity to act to prevent further crime. So they're very interesting from a crime prevention perspective. So in terms of what causes repeat victims, there's 2 basic theories here, and they're not in competition with each other, and they simply propose different mechanisms for each manifestation. And actually research shows that both are usually present in empirical crime data. So the first, as you can see on this slide, is the boost explanation. So this is where the initial victimisation itself increases or boosts the chance of another victimisation. So taking burglary again, if an offender burgles a house one day but can't carry all the property that they want to steal, they can return to collect it another day, or when that property has been replaced by the insurance and things like that. Or with regards to cyber fraud, you might think about it in terms of if someone has already clicked on a link to a dodgy website, they might be targeted again in a different way, so some sort of different communication style like an email or a text, because the offenders know that this person wasn't super careful the first time. This is the explanation, this boost explanation, assumes that it might be the same offender doing the victimisation. It's not always the case, though, because sometimes offenders will pass on information to other offenders about a good crime target, and that might elevate the risk of being victimised again. In contrast, so that boost explanation is very much offender focused, and it's about the offender's perception in terms of kind of how it operates. In contrast, the flag explanation suggests that there's something actually fundamental about the target that is inherently vulnerable. So that's what puts it at a higher risk of usually different offenders. So the flag kind of symbolism is that there's such a place or a person that has some sort of visible cues about that make it attractive to offending. And I'll just give you a personal example of this. So when I was in primary school, my family moved to another part of southeast England. And when we moved in, and this was early 90s when burglary was absolutely off the scale. And we moved into this house, and the previous owners told my family that they'd been burgled like 4 times in the previous 2 years. And my dad, being a bit of a paranoid sort, set about immediately changing the features of the house to make it less vulnerable. So due to the location of it, my parents loved the fact that it was kind of on a corner plot, so a bigger garden. But what that meant was there weren't sight lines from immediate neighbours. We had no immediate neighbours. So my dad cut down all of the very high shrubs and bushes around the perimeter to make it kind of less secluded. He did various other things. He installed a burglar alarm. He built a porch, so we had an extra layer outside the front door, which had clear panes of glass, so it was very easy to see if we were in or not. And we also had a dog who was soppy as anything, but looked quite ferocious to people who didn't know it. So by doing all of those things, my dad changed the flags that were attracting different offenders to burgle that house. And we were never burgled by the whole time we lived there. So this kind of concept of flags or visible cues is transferable to other types of locations and people. The flag may not be obvious to us, but it's perceptible to the offender and multiple offenders, that it puts the victim at higher risk and attracts the attention of multiple offenders. And just kind of segueing into some other research looking at what offenders actually say about all of this. So in the heyday of the 90s, the repeat victimisation research heyday, some senior probation officers teamed up with KMPs to interview 186 convicted burglary offenders, so 173 men, 13 women, and they just asked them a series of questions about how they selected their targets for burglary. But what they also asked them about was, okay, so that was your target, and the target could be a person or a place. And they said, okay, so how many times did you commit all these different offences in that place or to that person? And what we see in the table here that I've put on this slide, around a quarter of the sample admitted to targeting the same person or place, but with multiple types of criminal behaviour. So that's around a quarter of this sample that admit to this kind of versatility of criminal targeting. But that might be a very conservative estimate, because as the authors of this study note, because they originally selected the sample based on burglary convictions, it might well be that actually a broader kind of population of convicted people would actually admit to more repetition against the same target using different types of crime. So what this means is that offender versatility can help us to understand why some very unlucky souls or places experience lots of types of crime. And now I'm kind of getting into more about our topic here today, which is the fact that, so re-victimisation is this kind of broad umbrella term, and there's 2 main different types of re-victimisation. So the first is what I've been talking about. This is repeat victimisation, where certain people, places and products are repeatedly targeted for the same types of crime. And that's what we have a really extensive body of evidence about. Unfortunately, what we haven't got is an extensive body of evidence about the second type, which is poly-victimisation or poly-victims. And these are generally people, rather than kind of targets, that experience multiple types of crime over that kind of same time frame that's used for repeat victimisation, so usually 12 months. Okay, and what we do know about the limited research that's been done in this area is that it's actually more negatively impactful on health and well-being to be a poly-victim compared to being a single or repeat victim. So there are some really kind of acute harms that are associated with being victimised in different ways in short succession. And the concept of poly-victimisation has really only been around for maybe 15 or so years. So it's credited to Finkelhor around the kind of mid-noughties, who brought this term into the literature called poly-victims. But really, if you look back, as I've done over the kind of the repeat victimisation literature, there's lots of different ways that people describe that phenomena. So a few examples are multiple victimisation, cross-type victimisation, recurrent victimisation, chronic victimisation. So although poly-victimisation seems to have been the label that stuck, people have been talking about this for a long time already. But one of the things that Finkelhor and lots of different kind of co-authors did over many, many years was study the phenomenon of poly-victimisation in childhood. So they looked at children that were more likely to have both experienced child neglect, with abuse, with sexual assault. So they kind of looked across the entire childhood period to find these kind of concentrations of harm. And Finkelhor and a colleague here, Asdigan, in 1996 kind of proposed this argument that poly-victims were kind of bringing their risk levels across different contexts. So this risk level is transferring across different contexts, making them vulnerable beyond specific settings. So it's not just that the child was vulnerable in the home setting, although they might also be victimised at school or somewhere else. So there was something inherently vulnerable about that child in Finkelhor work that he said kind of had this risk transference across different places. And so what this suggests to us is that perhaps out of those two explanations for repeat victimisation, we can kind of draw on that flag explanation to explain why poly-victimisation might be concentrating in particular people more than others. So what we're arguing here is really to advance our understanding of poly-victimisation. It requires focusing on those characteristics that transcend single crime events. So those time-stable flags that explain why some people experience victimisation across contexts. And prior victimisation kind of suggests that the kind of risk factors associated with poly-victimisation will be quite different than those for single victimisation or repeat victimisation. So we need to study this kind of phenomena on its own, separate from those other types of victimisation, to understand the risk factors a bit better. And what we know about the broader kind of victimology research base is that people at high risk of re-victimisation will be typified by intersecting characteristics. So not just being a woman, but being a woman and multiple other things. So we wanted to get into that intersectionality of people because we know that there's a very good chance it's important, but we don't really know how risk factors might interact or what combinations of characteristics might be important for explaining risk of poly-victimisation. So consequently, our research question became, what specific groups defined by a unique combination of characteristics are at an increased risk of poly-victimisation over a 12-month period? And this was very much an exploratory study because, like I say, there's not much research out there. What has been done has mostly been done in youth samples. So if not childhood, like Finkelhor and colleagues, then some other people have done looking at kind of young people, or actually elder abuse, old people who are experience multiple forms of elder abuse. But we have very little about just regular adults. Okay, so we didn't really have a huge amount to go on. So this was an exploratory study that we didn't know the answer to. And the way we kind of tested our research question was we used the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey data. Now, this is an annual rolling survey that is nationwide. It's face-to-face surveying with a probability sample of people aged 15 years or older across the country, and there's a booster sample of Māori as well. So this is our crime and victims survey. It became our data frame, and I don't know if you know much about the crime and victims survey. It asks a whole heap of different questions. It collects demographic data from respondents and victimization experiences using what's called behaviourally based questions. So it kind of elicits out there, rather than saying, were you a victim of burglary, it said, has anyone entered your house without permission and stolen something? So those behaviourally kind of phrased questions. And all of that is done within a 12-month period. So each respondent is asked, within the last 12 months, have you experienced any of these types of behaviours? And in addition to that, they also ask a few questions about the respondent's life circumstances at the time of the survey. And so going back to my point about intersectionality, we know from global evidence, but also local examples, that this stuff matters, right? So this is just an example I've pulled out of the news from 2021 based on the crime and victim survey data. And what this found was that, probably to no surprise to anyone here, that Māori were statistically significantly more likely to be victims of crime than other ethnic groups. But once you kind of scratched the surface, you start to realise that there's layers of intersectionality going on there. So a third of the difference between Māori and other ethnic groups could be explained by the fact that Māori were on average much younger than the rest of the population, and we know that young people are especially vulnerable to being victimised. And another third of that difference was due to deprivation experienced by Māori. So you can start to unpick those different layers, different characteristics coalescing in these groups that are at a very acute risk of victimisation. So we wanted to kind of consider the whole person, as it were. Like, we wanted to kind of say not just, you know, the gender or the age or the race, ethnicity, but also all these other things that we can bring into the picture to try and understand what is the kind of combination of characteristics of these unique groups that is really an acute risk of poly-victimisation. And just to say, we couldn't test all of the ones that were on this slide, but we have tried to look at the ones that reliably kind of were associated with, not closely associated with each other. So we did some work at the beginning to work out which ones of those we could actually reliably look at that weren't what we call correlated with each other. Okay, and the other thing to know about the data is that it's managed within the secure IDI infrastructure, and that is the IDI stands for Integrated Data Infrastructure. And what that is that multiple data sets that are collected by lots of different state agencies are put into the IDI and linked on what's called a spine, so a unique identification number for each individual, in that they are linked and then they are anonymised so that researchers can go in there and do the research on those people that have been anonymised. So it's a very secure environment. There's lots of confidentiality rules to work with in the IDI lab. So as you'll see in our analytical results, most of the numbers are rounded to a multiple of 3, the nearest multiple of 3, so that it kind of never gives precise numbers. And also there are strict limits about when you have to suppress results, so when you're not actually allowed to reveal results. All of these kind of safeguards are in place to protect against any one individual being identifiable. And the people who answered the crime and victims survey, who were the participants of that, 93.2%, I think, of those participants consented for their data to be linked in the IDI. So that's really high percentage, actually, surprised me. And of those, around 96% were successfully linked to other IDI data. So you can see we've actually got a pretty decent representation of the people who've answered the crime and victims survey in that IDI space. Okay, so let's get into the sample then. So we used cycles 1 to 5, as I mentioned, of the crime and victims survey, and the sample of that entire kind of 5 waves of the survey was around 32,682. So those wiggly equals lines means approximately, because we're not allowed to give out precise numbers. But we weren't interested in everyone. What we were interested in doing is working out, once someone's been a victim once, what then is it about them that increases their risk to be victimised again in a different way? So what moves them from being a single victim to a poly victim? That's what we're most interested in. Okay, so what we did was we took those 32 odd thousand and we extracted out people who had experienced or had reported they experienced one type of crime in the 12-month survey period, and then people who reported multiple types of crime. So our overall sample was approximately 12,789. And poly victims could be a victim of lots of different types of crime. So I will get into that in the next slide. But our outcome variable was poly-victimisation, so they had to experienced two or more different types of crime within that 12-month period. And we also take our independent variables, so those personal characteristics were age, gender, ethnicity, whether someone had a disability or not, whether someone was experiencing financial stress or not at the time of the survey, whether they were in a relationship or not, whether they were experiencing moderate to high psychological distress, and their sexual identity as well. So a whole range of different kind of personal characteristics were our independent variables. But before we get into that, I just want to sort of give you just a kind of an overview. We couldn't give you every combination that every single person experienced, but this is just a kind of a zoomed out overview of the types of crimes that poly-victims experience. So here we see that, say, fraud, harassment, vehicle and bike theft, they're the most common crime types experienced by poly-victims, and they're very plentiful in the whole sample, as you can see as well. But there's also, to a lesser degree, trespass and theft are also reasonably common within this group. My colleague, Dr. Aotearoa New is currently finishing a project to determine the characteristics of groups that experience different combinations of those crime types. So watch this space for those results. Okay, a little bit more context then. When we calculated the risk or probability of further victimisation based on the number of prior victimisations, this is the graph we generated, and this shows that firstly, 1/4 of the sample had been victimised at all, so at least once in the previous 12 months, and of that group, more than 1/4, so around, I think it was 26.9%, were victimised 2 or more times. And then if we go a little bit further up that line, if you'd been a victim 4 or more times, nearly half of those people were victimised 5 or more times. So you can see that the risk of re-victimisation in this sample was what we call cumulative. So it increased, the risk increased or intensified with every victimisation experience. And whilst that is something we've known for a long time for burglary and intimate partner violence, this is the first study that we are aware of that reveals that it applies to other forms of re-victimisation too. The other kind of, we did lots of number crunching, and the other finding I think is particularly important is that whilst poly-victims only make up 15% of the entire sample, they experienced around 3/4 of all of the crime that was reported at all. So poly-victims experience an acute concentration of harm, and they're a very small portion of the population. So we can really see that kind of 80-20 rule in action there, although it's 75-15, of course. Okay, so we kind of started looking into characteristics on their own first before we got into looking at them combined. So this is where we looked at individual characteristics. We ran chi-square tests between each of those independent variables, those personal characteristics, and the victimisation status, so whether someone was single victim or poly-victim. And the standardised residuals of the chi-square test indicated that compared with single victims, a greater proportion of poly-victims were under 65 years, women, gender diverse, same-sex attracted, bisexual, Māori, did not have a current partner, and they might or have had a disability. And then poly-victims were also more likely than single victims to report moderate to high psychological distress and also financial stress. So what this does, or at least for us, begs the question of what happens when these characteristics intersect or interact. Do they intensify the risk of poly-victimisation? So I'll get on to that in a minute, but just to continue with how we were looking at these personal characteristics singly. So this is what we call a standard binary logistic regression, and do not worry if that means nothing to you. What I just want to pull out from this table is that the findings, the characteristics that I've left in white there are the ones that are statistically special. So these are the ones that we can have a reasonable degree of confidence they're associated somehow with the risk of poly-victimisation. And what this suggests is that older people who are over the age of 65 years are at a lower risk of poly-victimisation, which actually we kind of expect from the way the literature and research knowledge is anyway. But quite interestingly, people who identify as Māori, bisexual, single, or with financial stress and psychological distress are associated with increased odds of poly-victimisation. However, I must kind of confess that if you look at what's called the model fit statistics, so these tell us how much confidence we can have in this kind of model, there's a teeny tiny pseudo R-squared value, which indicates that actually this model doesn't fit the data very well, and there remains a substantial amount of variance, what's called unaccounted for. So I wouldn't place a lot of confidence in these findings. What this suggests is actually there are interactions going on that we cannot reveal by using standard traditional kind of techniques. So instead we turned to a research method that seeks to understand kind of complex interdependencies among explanatory variables, and it also kind of very much looks at within group variability. And this is a technique called conjunctive analysis of case configurations. And really at the heart of this, so if I go back to my previous slide, this is what we call a variable oriented method. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say for each of the variables or the characteristics in this example, we're trying to average out the effects across a lot of variability and just have one kind of main effect size, which is the OR, the odds ratio column. But what this method does in contrast is it kind of tries to take what we call a case approach, or you can think of it as a scaled up kind of case study approach, where each case is a unique combination of characteristics and those cases are all compared to each other in a variety of ways. So this is quite a different twist on traditional statistical approaches, because it's very much looking at the interactions and intersections between different characteristics. And the basic way it works is that we start off with our 12 or so thousand survey participants. And what we have to do is, or what we get the software to do, we map out all of the different hypothetical ways in which those characteristics can vary. And then we say, okay, so everyone who fits this particular group in the sample, we will put you in group 1, and we will calculate, firstly, we'll say how many of you are in that group. There's 20. This is a very hypothetical example. And then we'll calculate what proportion of people in this group were re-victimised, okay? Because again, we're interested in that difference between single victimisation experience and poly-victimisation. We then take the second group and we vary one of those characteristics, and everything else stays the same. And then we calculate how many are in that group and what the re-victimisation rate is. And we do that for as many groups as we hypothetically might find in the data. So you can imagine these truth tables get ginormous. But then we impose a number of kind of constraints on them. So because not every hypothetical profile will be observed in the data set. And we also, just because we don't want cases or case configurations with a very low number of people in them to kind of affect the results in an unreliable, to make the results unreliable, we remove all the groups that have fewer than 10 people. And just remember, the IDI confidentiality rules require us to also have a minimum of 6 people with the outcome variable. So we have kind of just restricted ourselves to just a limited number of these kind of truth tables. But when we kind of crunch all the data and we put everything in, and this is just the top 10 groups that have experienced the highest rates of poly-victimisation. And I know there's a lot of data on that slide, and I'm certainly not expecting you to kind of take it all in. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of examples. So that top group, or that top case configuration of characteristics, we see that firstly that 100% of people in that group, 100% of the 9 people in that group had experienced poly-victimisation. And these could be defined as people who are mid-aged, European, not with a disability, under financial stress, a woman, they don't currently have a partner, and they have moderately moderate to high psychological distress, and they were bisexual. Okay, so that's that top group who are the most acutely at risk of poly-victimisation. The next one down we see is actually not too different, except that they are with a disability and they're heterosexual, and their kind of percentage is 83.3%. I'm not going to go through the rest of the table, but one of the things that we looked at when we were looking at these kind of top 10 tables was looking at characteristics where there was an overrepresentation of a characteristic that compared to single victims. So we can see from this that it's predominantly young people, so under the age of 65. There is, compared to the prevalence in single victims, there is a disproportionate amount of Māori represented on this table. Same with disability, because actually disability is only 5% of the population in the sample we had, and things like that. So it's picking out kind of single characteristics. And so we're looking at these kind of combinations of characteristics going, okay, that's really interesting, but is there any particular characteristic that is statistically special here? Is it that always people who are a certain type of characteristic are always at risk of re-victimisation or poly-victimisation? And there's a way of finding that out. So there's an extension of the CACC method that allows you to kind of work out what's called the main effect. Okay, so going back to my hypothetical example again, if we can take two groups where the characteristics are identical except one particular characteristic, so in this case ethnicity, we can then observe that there's actually a range of re-victimisation rates. So the re-victimisation rates for those two groups are quite different. Bear in mind, this is hypothetical. And so that difference between the re-victimisation rates can indicate the impact of that characteristic, the main effect. And so in the CACC analysis, like the suite of methods that go with that method, this is calculated for all matched pairs of case configuration for a particular personal characteristic. And then what you do is you work out, so say, for example, I took all the people that were under 25 years. Okay, we take all the different case configurations that contain people who are under 25 years, and we look at all of those re-victimisation rates across all those different case configurations. So that's going to be a real spread of values, and we can then visualise those values against the mean re-victimisation rate across all of those case configurations for young people to see if there's any kind of characteristics that are particularly important from a statistical perspective. So this is how we visualize these results, and what we're doing here is, so say for example, I'll just take let's take the example of Asian, as it's the first box on this plot. If you are someone who is identified as Asian in the survey, you across all of those different case configurations that contain Asian people, there is a real range, a spread of re-victimisation rates that is both below and above that zero line, which is dashed. That's the mean, kind of the average re-victimisation rate. So actually, being Asian is not particularly statistically special in terms of your risk of poly-victimisation. So what we can see is actually, if we take a fairly artificial cut-off point and fairly conservative as well, that the box has to be either completely above or completely below that dashed line. We can see from this that the only characteristic on this slide that is statistically noteworthy is that moderate to high psychological distress. So what we can say about that is that people who have moderate to high psychological distress are almost always associated with a higher risk of poly-victimisation. But what we also see is a lot of non-kind of statistically special characteristics. So it's not just being a woman that influences risk, but it's that intersectionality associated with being a woman and other things, okay? So, and other characteristics that is associated with increased vulnerability to re-victimisation for many crime types. And just showing you the other results, so this is for age, disability, sexual identity and partnership status, we can see that being 65 years or older is almost always associated with a decreased risk of poly-victimisation, which is very much consistent with what we would say about victimology kind of theory. But we also see some really interesting findings for sexual orientation or sexual identity, where the people who identify as bisexual or same-sex attracted seem to be at a much greater risk of poly-victimisation compared to heterosexual people who seem to be at a much lower risk of poly-victimisation. But for reasons on the next slide, I would urge some caution in the confidence we can have in those findings. So now just coming on to the limitations. So like any study that uses survey data, especially national victimisation survey data, our analysis relied on a limited set of variables that will just have one timestamp, so what's called cross-sectional variables. So what we couldn't do is we couldn't determine whether, for example, psychological distress came before poly-victimisation, or if poly-victimisation came before psychological distress. So we've got no way of disentangling what we call the temporal sequencing of those variables, which is problematic for making any kind of statements of causality. So all we can say is there's associations, not that one thing causes another. The other thing to say is that, again, common to all victimisation surveys, is that 12-month time frame that survey participants are asked to recall back over introduces what we call truncation bias. So respondents who experienced their first victimisation more recently in the 12-month period have simply less opportunity, less days that's elapsed since, for them to experience another re-victimisation compared to people who experienced that crime type earlier in that 12-month period. So what we have here is a very conservative estimate of poly-victimisation. And then finally, we looked at the sample characteristics in relation to the census population. Now, this is not to knock Ministry of Justice; they do a superb job, and they actually contract out the survey to some sort of research organisation. But they do try and get a representative sample. But when we looked at the gender and sexual minority groups, we found that in our sample of the crime and victim survey, they were underrepresented compared to the actual population. So just to give you a couple of numbers here. So sexual minority groups comprised 2.96% of crime and victim survey respondents, but that's compared with 4.1% of the population in census estimates. So what that suggests is that there's challenges in reaching those groups, and this underrepresentation necessitates caution when we're interpreting findings that sexual minorities face elevated poly-victimisation risk. Really, we just need more research on that. We're just not confident of these findings because of that mismatch between the actual population and the survey population. Essentially, what this suggests is that the very high prevalence rates of poly-victimisation in society it really stresses the importance of reducing risk at the earliest opportunity to prevent further victimisation. That's not necessarily easy in practice to do, but if we do manage to do it, we stand the chance of reducing like very large amounts of crime and the harm associated with it for poly victims. And it's worth saying that poly-victimisation and the support services that underpin victimisation services requires recognising the role of intersectionality in shaping risk. And we would say that given that financial psychological distress is very associated with poly-victimisation, and this is something that has been found in other studies in other parts of the world, really that suggests, along with the financial stress profile as well, a multi-agency policy response to identify and address some complex needs going on in those particular groups. Okay, I won't labour the point there, but it's basically this has sparked lots of more questions about what this means for theory and how we might expand this in future research. So I'm just going to wrap up by concluding that our research suggests it's not one characteristic that matters when it comes to assessing risk of poly-victimisation, but it's combinations, and sometimes unique combinations, so sometimes very specific combinations of characteristics. And even though we couldn't look at it in this research, we suspect that those characteristics determine the circumstances that bring them into contact with their offenders. We don't know if that's multiple offenders or single offenders because in this research we didn't have variables that told us that. So we weren't able to test that flag explanation in as much kind of detail as we would have liked, but it does suggest that there are certain combinations of personal characteristics that seem to be associated with acute risk of poly-victimisation. And it also just suggests that the survey questions cannot answer all of our questions and they don't capture the full story. And we would like to continue this research agenda, but I'd be very interested to hear what you think. I'll stop now. Thank you very much for listening.